talk about the one final category that was commonly mentioned by the public who responded to our call for comments. And that was the introduction of more park staff. Isobel, you've already mentioned that park staff obviously suffered a reduction under COVID. The idea here is that there might be more staff and potentially designated litter wardens with powers of on-the-spot fines. One individual said, in Sydney, no one drops litter because there's huge fines for doing so. We need park wardens on bikes giving on-the-spot fines. So Isobel, starting with you, do we need more park staff to engage, encourage and fine people?
I suppose it links quite nicely to the conversation we were just having there around education as opposed to enforcement as a way forward. I guess also it's quite timely that the financial impact of COVID on the local authority here in Leeds was announced yesterday, and sort of the next financial year that we're sort of funding a massive gap somewhere in the region of about 118 million. So I don't necessarily feel that it's as simple as a solution of, employ more park staff, employing more staff, and paying more staff to pick up litter, and paying for those resources that actually under the current circumstances should be and could be better realigned elsewhere. I suppose the reality is that we're spending millions and millions of pounds on picking up people's rubbish, and if you continue as a society to accept that, then we'll continue to spend millions and millions of pounds on picking up people's rubbish. And I very much believe that, it has got to be around that behavioural change, that education, and asking people to take responsibility for themselves. I simply don't think it can continue in that vein and putting the responsibility back on park staff to deal with people's rubbish. We have focused some enforcement efforts in, and this isn't my particular area, this is the Cleaner Neighbourhoods team that lead on this, but we have employed a company in the city centre that do sort of, where they've seen perpetrators in the act, they do issue FPMs for instances of litter dropping. But I suppose, it's quite a high, footfall area, the need and the demand there was higher than perhaps, as Martin says, as to where we are in Roundhay Park, where it's a more affluent sort of area. So I do maintain that sort of position around education, awareness, raising that social norm approach.
So enforcement as a last resort. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. We're advocates for good enforcement, consistent enforcement and proportionate enforcement, so that you keep people on side. But it's not the ultimate solution. It's like the conversation we had before about bins. Are you going to put an enforcement officer on every street corner? Because I could go around the back of my house now and drop litter and know that nobody's going to see me. So how far do you go? The reality is we do need a stick, and you need to target enforcement at known hotspot areas. And then you need to publicise stuff in the media, fixed penalty notices being issued, and enforcement is happening, because it is part of behaviour change. But the reality is, when you come right upstream of the solution, if we're looking to really make inroads into this over the next 3, 5, 10 years, we've got to look right at the top and say we're over consuming, there's too much packaging, we need to tackle our single-use culture. So we need to have less rubbish to carry around in the first place, would be my argument. And then actually we need to incentivize people. So whether that's a deposit return scheme for bottles, so you're incentivized to take it back and not litter it, whether it's a charge for taking a paper cup when you take your coffee instead of having a reusable cup, so you're incentivized not to take that paper cup. For me personally, they're the things that will start to make a massive difference. Getting rid or tackling our single-use culture, because that's, as I opened up by saying, cigarette litter and packaging from food on the go. If I can get rid of those off our litter, I will tackle 80 to 90% of the litter on our streets. And that won't be done, or you'd spend an awful lot of money putting lots of bins, servicing bins, fining people. And I think whilst it's important, I think we're better trying to solve the upstream end of the problem rather than focus an awful lot of attention running around picking it up and fining people.
Thank you. May I invite some final comments on that matter? So on the matter of Moor Park staff enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also kind of a practical issue in terms, sometimes in the city centre. I mean, instinctively I'm against the enforcement, but I can see that it could work in certain places. But I think a lot of the issue in parks is people sitting down somewhere, having a picnic or whatever it might be, and then leaving. And I just think practically, as I think someone said before, the idea that you'd have staff who are kind of observing people, and then the moment that they leave, they pounce on them to fine them for leaving the litter. I'm not quite sure that that's the kind of society I want to be part of, and I'm just not sure practically it would work.
I think that sorry, Anna. I think that I agree with everybody else broadly. I know that we are constantly approached that why aren't people being fined? But I think the practical difficulties are huge, and I tend to think back to the old, well, they used to overlook Roundhay Park, but Jimmy Savile, the clunk click, I know we should be the sort of seatbelt thing. Yes, there were heavy fines for not wearing seatbelts. So there was a carrot and stick approach. But in actual fact, it's really considered to be quite antisocial not to wear a seatbelt. Very, very few people don't now, because the knock-on effect just to the health service if you don't wear a seatbelt can be quite dramatic. So I think we really have to work in we have to encourage and demonstrate the right way to do things, perhaps more. But if there was a magic bullet, if there was a way that you could make people think, actually, there is a risk of getting a fairly hefty fine, that might not be a bad thing. But I'd love to think of a way of doing it. I know in the centre of Leeds, this company, I don't think Leeds pay the company. I think they generate their own income. But then I think that you're open to, it's a private company trying to generate money, so they might be a little bit lax in the way they enforce what they're doing. I feel uncomfortable about this, like some other people, I think.
I think just one comment on that, if I may, that the seatbelt idea example is really interesting, because I would tend now to put my seatbelt on, A, because it's become a habit, and B, because I don't want to go through the windscreen, rather than I worry about being fined. And for instance, I often use the example of driving while using your mobile phone. You know, you can now get 6 points on your license and a few £100s of fine. I can drive around every day and see people driving on the mobile while using the mobile phones. So, you know, harsher penalties, more enforcement, it all costs money, and it's definitely part of the solution. I'm not saying we don't advocate enforcement, we absolutely do, targeted in the right place, just like bins, and then communicated to say people are being fined, so that, because that's the awareness. It's no good doing it if you're not going to tell anybody. But to focus on only that as a solution, like more bins, more enforcement, I think is the wrong way around. It's actually, yes, some of that, but close that down, but actually focusing on how we've arrived at this huge single-use culture we've got.